All right, so today we're going to dive into the world of Eckankar. Ever heard of it?
Oh yeah, it's definitely one of the more
Fascinating, right?
fascinating and kind of controversial new religious movements out there.
There. It's all about soul travel,
Right.
those out-of-body spiritual experiences. And the backstory is, well, let's just say it's got some twists and turns.
Yeah, definitely a good one for a deep dive, I think.
Absolutely. So you sent over some excerpts from a book by David Christopher Lane. The Making of a Spiritual Movement, the Untold Story of Paul Twitchell and Eckankar.
Mhm.
And this book, it really digs deep into the life of Eckankar's founder, Paul Twitchell, and some of the claims that have surrounded him over the years.
Yeah, Lane really went all in. He used letters, documents, photographs, even went as far as like comparing different texts just to get a clearer picture of Eckankar's history.
So, for our deep dive today, we're going to unpack some of Lane's claims. What's true, what might be embellished, and how does all of this help us understand Eckankar, both its past and present?
It's like we're putting on our detective hats and going through the evidence piece by piece.
Exactly. Let's start with Paul Twitchell himself. Lane paints a picture of his early life that's, well, it's a bit of a puzzle.
Right.
There are all these stories about Twitchell traveling to India and France, these big spiritual journeys. But the question is, are they true?
Yeah, that's where things get interesting. Lane couldn't find any like solid evidence to back up those travel claims, especially during the time when Twitchell was married to his first wife, Camille Ballo.
It makes you wonder why those travel stories were even circulating in the first place. I mean, maybe they were meant to add a certain mystique to his image. Make
Yeah.
him seem more.
Oh, absolutely. It's not uncommon, really, for spiritual figures to have these kind of um, origin stories that are a little embellished or even mythologized.
Right, right.
It adds to their authority, their appeal. It's a way of building a certain image.
Okay, so then there's Twitchell's connection to all these other spiritual teachers and groups. He spent time with Swami Premananda, Kirpal Singh, even had a brief involvement with Scientology, of all things.
He seemed drawn to a lot of different paths,
Mm.
always exploring different practices and philosophies.
And Lane suggests that some of those influences, especially from Scientology, actually found their way into Eckankar's teachings.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. Lane points out these similarities between certain Scientology techniques, like auditing, and some of the concepts that later popped up in Eckankar.
So it's like Twitchell wasn't just passively learning; he was actively weaving these different threads together into something new.
Yeah, he was definitely synthesizing different ideas, trying to create his own unique approach.
And this brings us to the 1960s when Eckankar officially emerges as a movement.
A pivotal time in America, really. You had this growing fascination with Eastern spirituality. All these new religious movements were popping up. It was like the perfect environment for something like Eckankar to take root.
Yeah, it's like the cultural soil was primed for something different, a fresh approach to spiritual exploration. And Twitchell, with his blend of Eastern and Western ideas, he stepped right into that space.
Absolutely. And one of the things that made Eckankar so appealing was its focus on soul travel, this idea of uh, consciously leaving your physical body and exploring other realms. That was pretty mind-blowing stuff back then.
It still is. And that concept, combined with Twitchell's charisma and the accessibility of his teachings through those male correspondence courses, it all helped Eckankar grow really rapidly. But but here's where things take a turn. Lane drops a bombshell in his book.
He accuses Twitchell of plagiarism, straight up.
Whoa.
Yeah, he claims that Twitchell lifted significant portions of his teachings from other sources, especially a book called
The Path of the
The
Masters.
Path of the Masters by Julian P. Johnson.
That's a serious allegation.
It is. And Lane doesn't just throw it out there.
Right.
He backs it up with specific examples, compares passages side by side, and the similarities are, well, they're pretty striking. One example that really stood out to me was how Julian Johnson's description of the divine current, this sort of spiritual energy, is almost identical to what Twitchell wrote in Letters to Gale.
Wow, so it wasn't just like borrowing a few ideas here and there, it was potentially copying entire passages.
Yeah, and then there's the whole thing with the mysterious guru who supposedly initiated Twitchell into Eckankar Sudar Singh.
Right.
Lane casts some serious doubt on whether this guru even existed.
Really?
Yeah, he points to documented evidence that shows that Twitchell was actually initiated by Kirpal Singh, not Sudar Singh.
Hmm.
And even more intriguing is that when Twitchell reprinted some of his earlier articles and books, he replaced Kirpal Singh's name with Sudar Singh.
So it's like he was deliberately trying to rewrite history. I mean, why would he feel the need to erase Kirpal Singh from the narrative?
It's a curious detail, for
Yeah.
sure. Just adds another layer to the story, you know? Makes you wonder what else might be out there waiting to be uncovered about Twitchell's motivations and the true origins of Eckankar.
So we've got plagiarism allegations, a potentially fabricated guru, and a movement that's gaining momentum. Where does Eckankar go from here? What happens after Twitchell's death?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Trust me, it gets even more uh, complicated. You've got internal power struggles, shifting leadership. It's a wild ride.
So we left off with Eckankar facing some pretty serious questions, those plagiarism accusations, the whole mystery surrounding Twitchell's history. Did any of that, did that slow them down at all?
You'd think,
Yeah.
but not really. Eckankar actually kept growing. It's like Professor Mark Juergensmeyer predicted in Lane's book. He said criticisms from outsiders, they wouldn't dismantle the movement. In fact, they might even have the opposite effect.
Like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. When a group feels like they're under attack, it can it can really create this us against the world mentality.
Oh, yeah, like circling the wagons. Makes their bonds stronger, their beliefs even more solid.
Yeah, exactly.
So, with all this baggage, how did Harold Klemp, Eckankar's new leader, handle things?
Well, I mean, he had a delicate task ahead of him, right? He had to acknowledge these controversies while reassuring followers that the core teachings were still valid. It's like trying to renovate a house while people are still living in it.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You got to be careful not to disrupt the foundation too much.
So did Klemp ever, directly address those plagiarism accusations against Twitchell?
He seemed to take a more indirect approach. Instead of directly engaging with those criticisms, he kind of shifted the focus to the personal experience, like what individuals felt on their own spiritual journeys. Less about the historical details, more about the personal transformation.
So, emphasizing the heart of Eckankar, the stuff that really resonated with people, regardless of all the noise surrounding it.
Exactly. And for many followers, that was enough. You know, they connected with the teachings, they found a sense of purpose, and that's what mattered to them.
Right, right. Reminds us that people's spiritual needs, they often go deeper than intellectual arguments.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's another thing Lane brings up, this shift in tone under Klemp's leadership. Things got a little, a little more cautious, even paranoid.
Yeah, that's right. He started talking about things like black magicians,
Mm-hmm.
psychic attacks, this
Mm-hmm.
idea that there were these negative spiritual influences out there that you had to be on guard against.
Wait, hold on. What exactly did he mean by psychic attacks? Like, what are those?
It's not entirely clear, but it seems to refer to this idea that there are negative energies, entities even, that can influence you or even harm you on a spiritual level.
Oh, okay. So like spiritual warfare.
In a sense, yeah. And some critics argue that this kind of rhetoric, it could create a climate of fear and suspicion.
Mhm.
If you're constantly worried about these unseen threats, it can affect your ability to just relax and engage with the spiritual practices.
Yeah, I see that. It's like the boy who cried wolf, right? If you keep warning about these dangers that never materialize, people start tuning you out, or they become overly anxious, looking for threats everywhere.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that some Eckankar members actually reported experiencing these very uh, psychic attacks that Klemp had warned about.
Really?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this focus on negative forces might have inadvertently, created a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Like if you're constantly looking for something, you're more likely to find it, even if it's not really there.
Yeah, it's like you're priming your perception to see danger everywhere.
So this brings us to a big question. Can a movement with this kind of potentially fabricated history and a leader who emphasizes these unseen threats, can it still offer authentic spiritual experiences?
That is the million-dollar question. And to help unpack it, Lane brings in the work of Ken Wilber. He's a pretty prominent philosopher and writer in the field of transpersonal psychology.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of him.
He talks about two key concepts, authenticity and legitimacy in religious movements. And these are really helpful in understanding Eckankar, I think.
Okay, break those down for me. What's the difference?
So legitimacy, according to Wilber, is about how well a religious movement integrates, meaning values, avoids taboos within its own level of development. It's about internal consistency. Does the system make sense on its own terms?
Got it. So legitimacy is about whether a religion's teachings are consistent with its own internal logic.
Right.
Okay, what about authenticity?
Authenticity, on the other hand, refers to the actual transformation that a religion delivers. Does it facilitate genuine spiritual growth? Does it help people move toward higher levels of consciousness?
So a religion could have internally consistent teachings, it could be legitimate, but if it doesn't actually lead to genuine spiritual transformation, then it wouldn't be considered authentic.
Exactly. And Wilber's point is that these two things don't always go hand in hand.
Interesting. So where does Eckankar fall on this spectrum of authenticity and legitimacy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Lane argues that while Eckankar may be illegitimate in the sense that its history might be fabricated and its founder may have plagiarized, it doesn't necessarily mean that the spiritual experiences people have within the movement are inauthentic.
Wait, hold on. How can something be illegitimate but still offer authentic experiences? That seems kind of like a paradox.
It is a bit of a paradox, but think of it this way. The content of a spiritual experience, like what you see, what you hear, what you feel, might be influenced by your beliefs, your expectations, but the level of consciousness that you reach could still be genuine.
So an Eckankar follower might have a vision of Rebazar Tarzes, that mysterious Tibetan monk who's so central to their beliefs, but that vision, it might actually be a manifestation of their own subconscious rather than an actual encounter with a spiritual being.
Exactly. Wilber argues that the authenticity of the experience lies not in the specific content of the vision, seeing Rebazar Tarzes versus, say, Buddha, but in the level of consciousness that it represents.
So the context is key, not necessarily the content.
Right.
That's helpful. But how do we know if we're having a genuine spiritual experience or if it's just, our subconscious playing tricks on us?
Well, that's where Wilber's concept of the pre-trans fallacy comes in.
Okay, hit me with it. What is the pre-trans fallacy?
It's this idea that we can sometimes mistake pre-rational subconscious imagery for trans-rational, truly transcendent experiences. We might think we're having this profound spiritual breakthrough when it's actually just our subconscious mind projecting familiar symbols, archetypes, that kind of thing.
So we could be misinterpreting those experiences, attributing spiritual significance to something that's actually coming from our own minds.
It's a possibility. Yeah. And Lane points out that this fallacy is especially relevant to Eckankar because they tend to view dreams as spiritual experiences. So they might be mistaking ordinary dreams for genuine encounters with spiritual beings or realms.
So how does all of this, the pre-trans fallacy, the distinction between authenticity and legitimacy, how does it help us make sense of Eckankar?
Well, it suggests that while Eckankar might offer genuine opportunities for spiritual growth, it's potentially fabricated history and reliance on questionable practices, it should give us pause. Mm-hmm. It reminds us that spiritual seeking is not without its risks, and we need to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking.
Like trust, but verify. We need to be discerning, even in spiritual matters. But where do things go from here? Does Eckankar, does it manage to reconcile its past with its present?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll look at how Eckankar evolved, what its legacy is, and what it all means for those seeking spiritual truth.
So we've talked about a lot with Eckankar, fabricated history, plagiarism accusations, a leader talking about psychic attacks. It's a lot. Where do they go from there? Do they even make it?
Oh, yeah, they do. And not only do they survive, they actually thrive. Eckankar still has a pretty big global following. Seems like they found a way to sort of reconcile their past with their present.
How do you do that? I mean, move forward with that kind of history.
Well, remember how Lane's book talked about how criticisms could actually strengthen a movement, create that us against the world feeling?
Yeah.
It seems like that dynamic just kept going. Those outside criticisms, they might have actually inadvertently helped solidify the community.
Right. Like they just kind of circled the wagons.
Exactly.
So how did Harold Klemp, Eckankar's leader, address all the controversies surrounding Twitchell?
Well, from what I gathered in Lane's book, it seems like Klemp focused more on shaping the future, rather than dwelling on the past. He introduced some new interpretations, kind of shifted the emphasis in certain teachings, but he always made sure to maintain that core framework of Eckankar's beliefs.
Like carefully pruning a tree to encourage new growth, but you still want to respect the roots.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Like Klemp was a skilled gardener,
Huh.
guiding Eckankar's evolution, but staying true to its essence. And remember Wilber's distinction between authenticity and legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if some parts of Eckankar's history are considered, illegitimate, that doesn't necessarily mean those spiritual experiences people have are inauthentic.
Right. The content of those experiences, it might be influenced by their beliefs, but the depth of their spiritual growth, that could still be genuine.
Exactly. And by focusing on that personal experiential dimension, it seems like Klemp tapped into that potential for real transformation.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that spiritual seeking, it really is a personal journey.
Absolutely.
What matters is how a path resonates with you, not so much the historical detail.
Right. And ultimately that's what seems to have sustained Eckankar, the transformations people experienced, the connections they made.
So even with all the controversy, they kept evolving. They adapted to the changing times, but they held on to that core identity. That's pretty amazing. But what about those psychic attacks Klump was talking about? Did that stuff kind of fade away?
It's interesting, those themes, they didn't completely disappear. Lane mentions in his book that Klemp continued to emphasize, spiritual vigilance. He even suggested that criticisms of Eckankar could be a form of psychic attack.
Oh, wow. So it's like he created this protective bubble around the movement, deflected anything from the outside by calling it a spiritual threat.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it kind of reinforces this idea that spiritual communities often develop their own ways of understanding and responding to the world.
Like they have their own internal compass.
Exactly. And for Eckankar, that compass seems to point toward individual exploration within a supportive community, even with all the controversy swirling around them.
So what can we learn from all this? From this deep dive into Eckankar?
Well, for me, I think it just highlights the resilience of spiritual seeking, even with all the challenges, the desire for meaning, connection, transcendence. It persists, and it reminds us that spiritual paths are rarely, straightforward. There's always going to be twists and turns, unexpected detours along the way.
And judging a movement just on its history or its founder, that doesn't give you the whole picture. You have to look at the actual experiences of the people in it, how it affects their lives.
Absolutely, Eckankar's story encourages us to look beyond the surface, dig into those complexities, appreciate the different ways people find meaning and purpose.
It's like a winding labyrinth, with unexpected discoveries around every corner. That's the search for truth, isn't it?
Well said. And maybe that's the most thought-provoking thing about all this, to realize that there's always more to uncover, more perspectives, more to learn about this human search for meaning.
Well, that's a great place to wrap things up. It's been quite a journey, this exploration of Eckankar. Hopefully, our listener now has a better understanding of this fascinating and complex movement. And remember, don't be afraid to keep exploring. Dive into those source materials, see where your own path leads you.
Absolutely happy exploring.